Good evening, this is Lawrence Holgate again, and this is episode 9, Understanding John Stuart Mill's classic book, Utilitarianism. We just finished episode 8, and since it was so short, I decided to do another podcast on the same day. So if you see two podcasts, both numbers 8 and number 9 on the same day, that is intentional. Episode 8 was very short, 5 minutes and 47 seconds. So we'll try to do a bit more today by doing episode 9 and introduce you to chapter 4 of my book, which is a discussion of Mill's proof of the principle of utility. Mill had previously stated in chapter 2 that the utilitarian principle has a theory of life as its foundation, and that theory has two elements. Happiness is desirable as an end, and secondly, happiness is the only thing desirable as an end. And Mill's task in this chapter of his book, of Utilitarianism, is to prove both elements and to link them to a final proof of the principle of utility. We're not going to get through the whole thing. I'll just introduce you to the topic, and then in episode 10, we'll finish the book, or at least we'll finish that chapter. I'm not sure we'll finish the book. So, in my book, I'm reading at chapter 4, and right now 4.1, first section of chapter 4. In chapter 1, Mill had said that questions of ultimate ends do not admit of proof, and he meant that a question about whether an ultimate end is good cannot be proved by reasoning. If an end is ultimate, then by definition it can't be proved, that is, reasoned to be good, on the ground that it's a means to something else that is good. It's just good. But Mill also said in chapter 1 that there is a larger meaning of the word proof, in which he says, quote, considerations may be presented capable of determining the intellect either to give or withhold its assent to the doctrine, and this is equivalent to proof. Mill will now tell us something about what he means by these, quote, considerations. And here's what he starts saying. Questions of ultimate ends, being matters of fact, may be the subject of a direct appeal to the faculties which judge of fact, namely our senses and the internal consciousness. For example, we use the faculty of sight to prove that an object is visible. We use the faculty of hearing to prove that a sound is audible. And Mill says, in like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people actually desire it. That's all we need. This is the promised consideration which Mill earlier claimed will convince us to give our assent to the doctrine that happiness is desirable in an end. And here's a long quote from Utilitarianism, Mill's book, at page 34. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he or she believes it to be attainable, desires his or her own happiness. This, however, being a fact, we have not only all the proof which the case admits of, but all which it is possible to require. That happiness is a good, that each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons. Mill concludes, happiness has made out its title as one of the ends of conduct, and consequently one of the criteria of morality. Let's back up a bit and look at the analogy that he has just made between the faculties of sight and hearing on the one hand and the faculty of desire on the other. And here's how the analogy figures in an argument, an inductive argument, in which you get probability as your conclusion. Mill starts out with the premise that the only proof it is possible to require that an object is visible or audible is that people see it or hear it. When I say that an object is visible, I prove that by simply saying people see it. Or if I say that an object is audible, I simply say, well, people hear it. Premise 2. The desirability of happiness is analogous to the visibility or audibility of an object. Conclusion, therefore, the only proof it is possible to require that happiness is desirable is that people desire it. So he's doing an argument by analogy. He's proving that happiness is desirable because people desire it, as he's concluding that from having made an analogy between visibility and seeing, or audibility and hearing. And the flaw in this argument is in the second premise. I'll read it again. The desirability of happiness is analogous to the visibility or audibility of an object. There is no exact analogy between desirability and visibility or audibility. To say that something is visible or audible is to say that it can be seen or it can be heard. But that's not what we mean when we say that something is desirable. If I say that a feeling, for example, pleasure, is desirable, I'm not saying that the feeling of pleasure can be desired. Instead, I'm evaluating the feeling as good. If we're in a grocery store looking for apples to purchase and I say to you, that one looks desirable, I don't mean that you can desire it. I mean, that is a good one. You should choose it. By the way, the philosopher G.E. Moore, 20th century, refers to this as the naturalistic fallacy. Although the analogy between desirable and visible is flawed, Mill might take another tack. He might say that he is recommending a standard for grading feelings as more or less good or more or less desirable. The standard would involve taking a simple poll of people who have experienced that feeling. The question for them is, do you desire this feeling? If a majority of people answer in the affirmative, then the feeling is graded as desirable, that is good. If the majority is over, say 90%, then it is graded as highly desirable, very good, or excellent. When asked about the feeling of happiness, meaning pleasure in the absence of pain, it's probable that a large majority of people who have experienced happiness would give it the highest grade. When asked about the feeling of unhappiness, pain, it is probable that the same majority would give it the lowest grade, the grade of highly desirable or very bad. However, there are alternative standards for grading happiness or pleasure. Mill has previously said that he wants to evaluate pleasures by the competence of those experiencing them. He says, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who would have experience of both give a decided preference, that is the more desirable pleasure. Other standards would use measurable ranking factors such as intensity and duration. Jeremy Bentham, for example. This might complicate the simple poll outlined earlier. To prove that happiness is desirable, it will now be necessary to accommodate those who insist on knowing the kind of pleasure before they will tell us whether or not they desire it. After all, we've been told by Mill that those who are completely acquainted with both the mental and the physical pleasures, quote, give a decided preference to the mental pleasures. There are some people in this group who might go further than this and deny that they have any desire for some of the physical pleasures, for example, sexual pleasures, or the pleasure of mind-altering drugs. Does this requirement skew the grading results of the poll? If it is true that some people in the polled group do not prefer some of the pleasures that are desired by others, then the standard used for grading happiness is altered as follows. And I'll say this slowly. Happiness is desirable only if those people competently acquainted with both mental and physical pleasure actually prefer it. Now notice that this does not change Mill's general conclusion that happiness is desirable because it is desired. Restricting the members of the group who are polled does not change the conclusion. Those who desire happiness will grade it as desirable, even though they might grade some pleasures as less desirable than the grade given by others. It's still true that happiness is desirable because it is desired, regardless of whether the desire is mental or physical. It's still true, I'll repeat, that happiness is desirable because it is desired, regardless of whether the desire we're talking about is a mental desire or a physical desire. So that concludes Mill's proof that happiness is desirable as an end, or at least it's one of the things desirable as an end. I'm going to cut off now. We're at 10 minutes, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next Monday.